Hello and welcome to the big fight. So we've had the first budget of the Modi government. Arun Jaitley as finance minister delivering his first budget. Somewhat mixed reactions. Expectations, of course, were very high. So no matter what he did, there was always going to be a certain amount of disappointment. Some big steps taken, other steps we will be waiting to see the government perhaps rolling out as we go forward. But one of the crucial questions that we're going to continue to address is how is all of this going to be implemented and what's the next step? The budget, sometimes more attention is given to it than is entirely necessary. A lot of the real work is done behind the scenes. So what should the government be doing now in the next few weeks and months to signal it is serious about rebooting India and about rebooting the Indian economy? Now, to answer that question, we have assembled on this program some of the finest thinkers that I know of on the Indian economy, who are all going to be giving their practical suggestions for what the finance minister and the rest of the government should be doing over the next few weeks. So let me start off by welcoming, representing the BJP, NK Singh, who's actually had his hand on the tiller, as it were, for a long time. So he has a clear sense of what the government should and can be doing. Manish Tiwari joining us on the big fight. As I was just saying, one of the fringe benefits of the UPA losing the election is that we do get Manish back on the big fight. So it's great to have you with us. Tarun Das, former chief mentor of CII. It's always great to have you with us, Tarun. We have Sunil Kangunjal joining us, joint managing director of the Hero Motor Group. Sumant Sinha is joining us, CEO Renew Wind Power. Prasenjit Bose is joining us as well. Mukesh Bhutani, Chairman BMR Advisors, MK Venu, one of the senior most and the most respected financial journalists that we have. And finally, Dr. Gurcharan Das, author of a large number of books of what India should and can and perhaps will be doing going forward. So as I said, some of the top thinkers we have here, and I'm going to get you all to quickly cycle through. Why don't I kick off by saying just the budget, very quickly, if there were one or two things that you could perhaps feel he may have done slightly differently. NK, shall I start with you?
I think that he has sent all the right signals: rekindling investment and saving cycles, reinvesting investor with confidence, bringing about a non-adversarial tax regime, giving a big kickstart to infrastructure, to housing, and of course to agriculture.
There's nothing you would have done differently.
Pardon?
There's nothing you would have done differently.
Well, very frankly speaking, if I had the luxury of a higher rate of growth, I would have done a whole lot on taxation. But regrettably, he inherits a sub 5% growth, and he inherits a huge expenditure overhang. Okay. So the flexibility was rather limited.
What would you have done differently, Manish?
You see, this budget, and without sounding partisan, was shot both on rhetoric and delivery. You know, if you were to step back and look at it, India is a $2 trillion economy. If the finance minister would have said, I will grow it into an $8 trillion economy over the next 5 years, and these are the steps that I am going to take, and this is what I am going to specifically do in the first year in order to achieve that objective, at least from the point of view of rhetoric, it would have been soaring. In fact, the finance minister got bogged down in too much of detail, too much of micromanagement, which could have been left to the administrative ministries. Even on the two big takeaways, you know, FDI and insurance and FDI and defense. Now, FDI and insurance, they've done a complete U-turn after opposing it for 10 years. They decide to go ahead. On FDI and defense also, you see, the existing regime, allow me to complete, you know, allows for more than 51% on a case-by-case basis. And keeping the control in Indian hands, I don't think is going to bring in any FDI, either in insurance or in defense. All that it is going to do is recapitalize the existing insurance companies, the Indian companies and a joint venture.
Mr. Munjal.
The big bang announcements were not there. It was like a workman's budget. It does not give us the 5-year view of the government's plan, overall strategic plan of the government. It's clear they've talked of infrastructure, high-speed rail network, which is very good, by the way, and also of growing industry, especially manufacturing, focusing on the areas which have a multiplier and job creation, tourism, health, manufacturing, defense industry. I think overall, I would say it's a pretty good job.
Okay, what next now?
I think the key is actual implementation and execution of these plans. I would like to see a monitoring mechanism directly in the finance minister's office and also in the prime minister's office to monitor all of these big plans on a monthly basis and tell the public what's going on. So focus on outcomes besides just the focus on the outlays. And give us a view every month or every quarter where we stand against the expectation or the commitment.
In his interview to me on budget day, what Mr. Jaitley essentially said is that we will do GST. We may have to compromise on a couple of areas where there are strong views, such as in petroleum products and things like that. Slight compromises will have to be made, but then we will get GST through. Is that good news insofar as you're concerned? A slightly compromised GST, but GST.
It's not just for us. Which is what we had already. Industry has now been saying for the last few years. Please get this implemented, even if we have to make some minor changes in the system. Let's get this off the ground. It has such a massive benefit to the entire population of the nation, to industry, to economy, to tax collection. Everybody gains. The center gains, the states gain. There is frankly no good reason for it not to get implemented.
Okay.
I think we got bogged down with too much politics in this.
Okay, one last word before you leave us. Just wanted to check. At the end of the day, if you had to get a final word from you, 7 to 8% growth rate within a couple of years, do you think, what would you say the probability of that is? We will return to 7 to 8% within 2-3 years.
I think if there is a turnaround globally, which is showing signs in the US and the UK already, 7 to 8% for India is eminently possible. And if you see the building blocks that they've laid in multiple areas, that will help us accelerate it. I don't know if it's possible in 2 years, but certainly in 4 years it's doable.
All right, Mr. Manjal, thank you so much. All right. Tarun Das.
I would have liked to have seen some quantified vision statement. We are going for $1 trillion of foreign investment in the next 10 years. China got $1 trillion in 12 years. We will do better than them. And in the next 5 years, it's 500 billion is what we set ourselves.
So
and that's why we are doing all this.
That's like what Manish was
because
saying.
We need these resources. We need the resources for development and growth. Second, I would have liked him to say that we are importing 70% of defense equipment. Why are we doing this FDI? Because we want to change the thing. I want 70% of defense equipment made in India, not imported from abroad. So some things like that, which would, I think would capture the mind and would capture the imagination. So just saying FDI 49%, just insurance for, but why are we doing this? I think if the rationale in a few sentences could have been said, and I think it would have made greater impact.
Okay. Mukesh, you've now read all the fine print. You've seen it in some detail now. What would be your assessment in cold blood now of the budget?
He made a mention about Financial Legislative Reforms Commission. This commission was set up in 2012, but there's no, this commission report is ready. It's to be implemented. So important statements, are we going to have a super regulator for the financial services sector? No mention about that. Similarly, there was the URI committee that was looking into the monetary policy. Mention, but no plan as such. The other heartening thing was the mention of the Expenditure Commission. This has come back after 10 years, actually more than 10 years. This was the first time Mr. Chidambaram mentioned in the UF budget in 1998. But what is the plan for setting up the Expenditure Commission? How is it going to look at it? What are the targets, specific targets from a fiscal responsibility standpoint? Nothing stated so far. So yes, it seems to me that his fiscal target is driven both by revenue and expenditure side.
But you're happy enough with the Expenditure Commission? I know there were some people who were hoping and expecting that he'll actually come out and saying, I'm going to phase out subsidies, I'm going to reduce subsidies. But doing it this way, where you actually have an Expenditure Commission which is going to study the whole issue and then come out with a solution, that's fair enough in your point.
Well, an Expenditure Commission would be like any other expert committee. The question is...
But then you can say we are implementing the recommendations of the Expenditure Committee rather than saying the Modi government is slashing subsidies.
Our challenge with successive governments has been that when you pick up any expert committee recommendation, you can't implement it piecemeal. It has to be a packaged implementation. And that's really the whole challenge we were facing for the Tax Administrative Reforms Commission. So now what he has done, he's cherry-picked issues like broad-basing advanced ruling authority, setting up more benches, reconstituting the Settlement Commission. Now these were part of recommendations that were there in TARC, but that's not the entire package.
Okay.
So if you really want
the commissioner, then you have to take everything.
Yes.
Suman?
My thoughts on the budget, by and large, as I've said yesterday as well, are fairly positive. I think that he's touched on a lot of different areas. He's tried to keep some continuity while at the same time try to give some difference in their own sort of in this new government's thought process. But I think the one area where I felt that he could have been a little bit more robust in his statements, and I think the fact that there weren't some overarching philosophical statements about the new government's economic vision or the economic direction, I think those, the fact that those were missing in the context of such a long budget speech, I think he could have used some of that time a little bit more artfully to talk about the new philosophy. But I suspect that at some level the new government didn't really want to do that, because I think the overriding the point of view is better not to promise too many things, better to sort of put your head down and deliver, and as those things get delivered, I think it'll be there for the world to see.
NK, I'm going to come back to you on that, because there are two ways of responding, I think, and this point has been made now by a number of people on the panel, that perhaps the vision could have been articulated a bit better. Now, two ways of looking at that is, the one, some people would argue that that's exactly what Narendra Modi has been doing from the Ram Leela ground speech to after he took over. There has been a certain articulation that this is what we are going to try and do in this government. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of the flip side of that, I guess, would be that if you articulate it really clearly and repeatedly, it does get certain animal spirits going among investors, which makes the job of the government that much easier.
If we look at the BJP's manifesto, the one qualitative difference between the BJP's manifesto and the Congress manifesto is that the BJP's manifesto is a statement of the broad intent and principles. The Congress manifesto goes into far greater specifics, and therefore speaking.
So you're saying the vision is out there; it doesn't need to be restated in a budget speech.
And this long speech of the President to the joint session of Parliament just 1 week ago lays and articulates the vision in somewhat great detail. So I think there is nothing as much on the vision as the implementation and delivery on the ground. Okay. That is of critical importance.
You agree with that?
Vikram, I don't agree with that, because like you, I also interviewed Mr. Jaitley on a public broadcast channel, and he was telling me a lot of things. Like on GST, he clearly said that, like he told you, all issues are resolved except one or two sectors, petroleum. Yeah. And then he told me something which stunned me. He said real estate, which was the biggest stumbling block which politicians don't want to give up their control on. He says all chief ministers have agreed the real estate be part of GST. Now, it is such a big achievement that he's got an agreement on that, and such a transformative tax reform which is both anti-inflationary and provides fiscal stimulus. You know, you don't have a reform which does both. So he could have given a clear-cut roadmap. So I asked him for a rate. He said, no, I don't want to talk about a rate. So
he sort of hinted to me saying by the end of this year,
no, but by
the end of this financial year, you will get.
But Vikram, he could have said a range between say 14 to 18, whereas total indirect taxes today are 24%.
There I think is where what Sumant is saying, that he wants to first do it instead of saying "haan karenge," because we've been
very frankly,
give a range. And the other thing he told me was that he will definitely go for. He said, contrary to what news reports are saying, Mr. Modi will go forward with the UID program, direct cash benefit transfer, and not interfere with price signals, take subsidy out of interfering, with the price signals. But all these things should have been said in the budget. There's such great things to say.
I'm going to be paying except what Arun Jaitley, you're right, what Arun Jaitley said in some of the interviews after the budget speech were actually perhaps more interesting than what he said during the budget speech, and I'll play some excerpts of that in just a couple of minutes.
And
let me get you in on.
I wish that his interview had been his budget speech. This is a historic opportunity, the first budget, even though it's 4 months past. For example, he had 3 jobs to do. His job was 1, revive growth and bring jobs, control inflation and fix public finances. Now, reviving growth and jobs, he could have easily said, okay, I'm doing all this in infrastructure, and this is going to revive growth and bring so many jobs. He could have gone then controlling inflation. I am sticking to this ambitious target of the fiscal deficit because it will help us to control inflation.
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to say is,
but he said a lot of that in the interview.
Yeah, and so my point though is that, we should learn from Margaret Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher used to say that I spend 20% of my time doing the reforms and 80% of the time selling reforms. And this was the big mistake of the reformers in the UPA government, that they had to reform by stealth. They never sold it. They didn't even sell it to their own party, not even to Sonia Gandhi.
But maybe this government feels it doesn't have to sell. Hang on, the difference is, and I'll get both Manish and NK on this, the difference is perhaps that in this government you don't need to sell reform because A, there's a brute majority, which the government has, and B, I think by and large the BJP is reformist.
I think there has been a huge transformational change in the thinking of the BJP as the BJP has modernized itself, which is reflected in a number of announcements which Mr. Jaitley has made.
You see, it's not only a question of selling reforms to your own party, provided you believe in it. There's a larger constituency which you need to create. But you see, there's another problem with the budget which I want to flag, Vikram. And if you look at all the announcements of intent, and if you were to add them up and juxtapose it against the fiscal deficit targets which the finance minister has set for himself, the math doesn't add up. Even a back of the envelope calculation would say the fisc would go up to 6%. So therefore, there is something fundamentally wrong with the budget numbers. Number two, when you talk about asset creation, when you talk about, broad basing the economy, out of a 17 lakh crore expenditure, if 15 lakh odd crores is still going towards revenue expenditure, only 2 lakh crores towards asset creation. But where is the growth going to come from?
That structural weakness has not been addressed.
Yeah, where is the growth going to come from?
One point that contrary to what Mr. Jaitley's predecessor left, in which capital expenditure and plan expenditure had a cut of 90,000 crore, this budget gives you a 26% growth in plan and capital expenditure, a dramatic difference from what Mr. Chidambaram had left. And the maths does add up, excepting for the fact that he had the tragedy, Manish, that his predecessor had shoved expenditure done this year into next year, and that he had taken credit for next year's revenue into the interim budget in arriving at figures which are exceedingly dubious.
Well, I think Mr. Chidambaram has rebutted that squarely, so therefore I don't need to go into that.
Let me now get in somebody who feels we're going in completely the wrong direction in the first place, which is Prasenjit. Prasenjit.
This government has come in the backdrop of gross dissatisfaction of the electorate over the state of the economy, be it in terms of high inflation, which the Congress government failed to control, be it in terms of slowdown in growth, increase in unemployment, and also a sharp increase in external vulnerability. I think that this budget doesn't make any departure, significant departure. It is almost like a Chidambaram budget. This is a UPA 3 budget, rather than being a budget of a new government which even wants to pursue a new direction. I think that Mr. Chidambaram's numbers, this is for Manish, it never added up. For the past 2 years, Mr. Chidambaram has been giving us figures which did not add up. His revenues last year fell short by over 80,000 crore. There was a massive cut of 80,000 crore in plan expenditure. But I think that Mr. Jaitley will also meet the same fate. Because if you look at closely at the budget numbers, he has assumed a nominal growth of almost 13.5-14% of the GDP, which in real terms I think will be about 6 to 7%. Even the economic survey doesn't think that India is going to grow by 6 to 7%. It thinks it will be around 5.5 or something like that. So I think his numbers also are very over-optimistic. His revenue numbers are exaggerations. He has given so much of tax concessions, and yet he expects some, by some sleight of hand, by some mystical revenue buoyancy, coffers are going to get filled up, and he is going to spend out of that.
All right, fine. Tarun, are you concerned about the quality of numbers and implementation at the end of the day is the key?
I think if the management of this government is strong and effective in terms of implementation of the projects and things that have been announced and which are also in progress from the previous government's time, then we actually can reach near 6% growth this year, 2014-2015. I think that the economic survey can be shown to be understated, but it depends on management. Now, the reputation of the Prime Minister coming from Gujarat is that he has a reputation for strong implementation, strong management. If things can happen fast, if clearances for investment can be given in 30 days and not 300 days, then I think we will see different kinds of numbers at the end of the year, and we can be at 7.5% growth in the year after.
Okay, so that actually brings me now to the sum and substance of what I do want to discuss now for the rest of this program. Let's set the budget aside for a moment. What happens now? Mr. Modi has pledged himself to rebooting India, rebooting the Indian economy, and that's really one of the key expectations that everyone has of this government, that there will be a rebooting. Sumant, what else would you like to be seen? What would you like to see in the rest of July, in August, in September, done by this government to say, to give everyone the confidence that yes, things are different and things will continue to be different?
The government has actually got off to a fairly good start. There is a much more business-like mindset in government, and that they actually want to get things done. Even if nothing much really had happened in the budget, and the government is simply focused on trying to improve the ease of doing business in India by focusing on things like the land acquisition bill. I think that is something that really needs to be relooked at. Labour reforms, which they've started in a very small way in Rajasthan, if that can be made more widespread. The third is the whole issue of course of GST implementation, which we still have to see how that happens. And so, there's going to be a lot of focus on that. Number 4 is the whole issue of retrospective taxation, and more generally how the tax department behaves in a more broad sense.
Okay.
So I think things like that really are the things that we'll all really be focusing on,
okay,
and looking at on a day-to-day basis to see how the government really moves forward. And so far at least the signals are fairly positive that the government does mean to be more efficient and more focused on trying to push business opportunities as we go forward.
He has to explain this idea of minimum government, maximum governance. This idea is a catchphrase, but it needs to be conceptualized.
Take off from that, and also I'm continuing to understand whether does he need to keep on articulating it and explaining it, or does he feel I've got the numbers, I don't need to worry? And it's strange because if you think about it, Narendra Modi was somebody who was speaking to the nation almost non-stop before becoming the Prime Minister. We haven't actually heard that much from him after that. When I saw him for the first time after the railway budget, I said, we're seeing him speaking now after nearly a month.
Taking off from what Gurcharan said, which Arun Jaitley told me specifically when I asked him, I said there are 80,000 megawatts of power capacity waiting for coal, and many of those coal blocks, almost all of them, 195 CBI inquiries still pending, Supreme Court judges, other regulators coming in and working at at their own levels, where the outcome is stalling of projects. So I said, Mr. Modi once last week, I think, made a statement that we need to sit together and with other institutions. Now, there's a change of government, but the other institutions are the same, right? We need to figure out what's going on. And Jaitley said, yes, there's a dire need to just figure out what's going on. Otherwise, if all institutions act
the way they did,
as law unto themselves, so he says that nothing will move. And he was expressing grave worry on that count. I think on that we need some articulation.
Venu, I think if that is a thought which has been articulated to you, it goes against the fundamental doctrine of separation of powers. Institutions have to behave in an independent manner so that they can keep a check on each other. That is the essence of the constitutional scheme. And if we are going to see the subversion of that constitutional scheme in the name of economic development, democracy is going to become a casualty. So therefore, there is a
complete gridlock. Manish, the flip side should not be complete gridlock.
He was talking about consultation.
How can you consult with the Supreme Court? How can you consult with the judiciary? Because the fundamental doctrine of separation of powers envisages that the judiciary is a watchdog.
But the flip side of that cannot be complete and total gridlock. In the UPA, what is happening was sometimes two ministries would refuse to talk to each other. That's not separation.
Two ministries not talking to one another is a different
ministry
case.
To get a
that's what we are talking about.
He was talking about institutions. Institutions coordinate with other institutions. There is a danger.
For instance,
there is an inherent danger in that philosophy itself. If you want to break the institutional gridlock, you have to bring about administrative reform.
But administrative reform, I can disagree. It's not something you do in a budget. Institutional reform and administrative reform of the sort that NK is saying happens by ministers and the Prime Minister telling bureaucrats, take decisions, don't worry about the consequences. If somebody questions them, we will back you. That's how that particular
I
problem
don't
gets
think
fixed.
it's as simple as that. I don't think it's as simple as that. You have to fundamentally reform the structure of government. Government as it is structured today is in fact antithesis or is risk averse, and that is not going to change till the time you do not have a revolving door policy, you do not bring experts into government. So the administrative reform is not a minister telling his bureaucrat that you take a decision, I'll take responsibility. In any case, the responsibilities of the minister at the end of the day.
I wouldn't be as pessimistic as he is. The period between 1991 and 93 was a huge transformation that took place. Every Thursday there was a meeting of the Committee of Secretaries, and on Friday when the news came in Economic Times or wherever, it was like Diwali, because there was a capacity created, there was an ethos created.
Okay, Prasenjit, you may disagree with some of the directions and neoliberal or neo-capitalist economics, but if what we are hearing is getting things moving and getting some of that administrative ease moving, that's the crucial next step. That surely is something you wouldn't disagree with.
I mean, the program is big fight, but what you are having down there is a big consensus.
I'm waiting for you to disrupt the consensus.
I don't think that this is... I am disrupting that consensus. I think that this so-called policy paralysis, what was it the outcome of? It was the outcome of a brazen loot of resources, from spectrum to coal to natural gas to all kinds of natural resources. There was private expropriation with the complicity of the highest echelons of the government, of the bureaucracy and so on. And thanks to the judiciary, at least some of it was stopped. Now, what do you mean by, we have to get things going? Do you want to get things going in the same way and allow more corruption and more loot of resources, or you want to do it in a different way? That, these kind of loss of revenues and loot of public resources. So what is the different way? Has Mr. Jaitley been able to spell out what is the different way? No. So that is the intellectual bankruptcy of this. Mr. Gurcharan Das is saying that, reform, he has to sell reform. He has you and people like you to sell reform through 24/7 news channels day in, day out. It's not a question of selling reforms. It is a question, I personally think that this government will be judged on the basis of outcomes. All right. All these reforms, blah, blah, blah is not going to cut any ice. My point is, people are suffering from high inflation. People are suffering because of low growth. People are suffering because of high unemployment. Now, whatever reform you say, people want results on these counts. If this government fails to deliver, then you will see the same medicine, bitter pill that Mr. Modi is talking about, that bitter pill will await this government also. That is my basic point.
We don't want to return to what he was calling crony capitalism.
No, but I think that this is a false choice. I mean, getting things going doesn't mean getting it going through scams. Getting things going means doing the right, implementing the decisions in a transparent way, which will foster growth, create jobs, and create virtuous circles of and multiplier effects of what growth
reforms
implies.
are they synonymous? Reforms are they synonymous with scams and
unfortunately, that is the mindset of Prasenjit. He thinks that capitalism is by definition crony capitalism. He doesn't understand that capitalism can be rules-based capitalism which can benefit everybody. That competitive markets is, and he talks about results. Well, the last 2 decades, when our growth rate has been the highest in India's history, and certainly double of what it was during his favorite period, which was the license Raj, that is results. So what we talk about reforms and selling reforms to the people is selling the notion of rules-based capitalism.
I want to come back to some specifics now. What's the next thing that the government can actually do? So let's just pick on 2 or 3 items. Number one, we were having a chat about GST and the possibility of GST and actual action on GST being a major signaling mechanism. But this, for example, is what Arun Jaitley, the finance minister, said to me when I specifically asked him about what could possibly happen with GST. Here is a clear assurance and promise, in a sense, that he gave about action in the near future. The other big reform that people were really looking for was on the goods and service tax. So you've indicated you're going to proceed.
You see, I have had in a period of 1 month 2 conferences of the state finance ministers, and I've become reasonably confident.
But there are still a couple of areas, entry tax, petroleum products.
You see, therefore, I have always used this phrase that reforms are an art of the possible. If I can't get an ideal GST, should I not get a GST at all? So my choice will be between an ideal GST and a good GST. So if one or two items has to be kept about and we have to start, I'm quite willing to look at that. There are one or two additional issues which, curiously, it's our NDA governments which have raised them. So I intend to use others in my government also to persuade them and find an amicable answer to it.
Okay, but the one or two areas which are still grey area, which the states are not entirely accepting, whether it's petroleum, whether it's entry tax, will you just say allow that to be for the moment and let's go ahead?
That's what I indicated. Then we'll have to take a considered decision between an ideal GST and a good GST.
So are you confident that we can get the various deadlines that are being spoken about? First,
well, I have now, please give me a chance. I have said in the course of this year, I will try to come out with a legislative scheme.
So GST, we can see what's going to happen. One other possible idea, and I'm going to come to you, Mukesh, and this is one of the major reasons for a complete loss, perhaps the single biggest reason for loss of investor confidence in India was whatever was happening on the taxation front, retrospective tax, tax terrorism, and so on and so forth. We heard snatches about that in the budget and in later interviews about how important advanced rulings is going to be and so on and so forth. What would you like the government to do?
All political parties agree GST is good. What's going on perhaps, and I'm not trying to read the FM's mind, is the constitutional amendment. We are forgetting that this has to go through a constitutional amendment for the passage.
And many states have to adopt it.
And we all know the strength on the floor. Just in case this constitutional amendment gets defeated, I think it could cause an element of embarrassment to this new government. I think that unless he gets support from all constituents, you are looking at not...
But I think he will get that. I mean, there is, provided all the compromise is done.
No government will be so foolhardy as to introduce a constitutional amendment bill, which is not likely to...
I will only take you back to the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister's press conference in 2010, which I think, Vikram, you also attended, where when he was specifically asked the question about GST, and he says there are extraneous political strings which have been attached by the BJP to its passage. Now, this is not me saying it. This is the former Prime Minister of India saying it. So, therefore, if that is the attitude they had adopted at that point in time,
so you will have,
let's see
as to how political strings this time.
I do not know. Let's see how it plays itself out. So, therefore, a constitutional amendment which has to be ratified by the states is not easier said than done.
So by
there is a lot of bad blood. There is a lot of bad blood. There's a lot of blood which has been spilled on the streets in the last 10 years.
GST,
so therefore, there will be obvious consequences.
Still political issues around it.
And you mustn't, when you're looking at next steps and things to be done tomorrow morning, GST is going to take time.
Okay.
So that's all I want to say.
So then
you can keep your eye, work on it.
So
there's a whole lot of work to be done.
So
you must focus elsewhere.
Things to be done tomorrow. Park GST, it's a big reform step. Maybe it'll happen a little later. One, we've talked about administrative efficiency. We've already discussed that and what could happen. Third item, which I was just talking about, which I was asking you about, therefore, is send some clear signals on taxation. Tell your tax department, rein in the tax department and saying, please end what is being seen as an era of victimization of corporates.
Vikram, everyone has different kind of disputes. I think what we need is deep administrative reforms to address dispute resolution on a go-forward basis. You need to have courts organized for speedier disposal. You need to have interpretative provisions to clarify the law. You need greater degree of training, investment in IT, infrastructure, so on and so forth. So what he has done now is a great start. But I don't think this is a solution from a long-term point of view. If India needs to attract investment.
I'm not sure it's not entirely as, yes, I know all of those things need to be done and the advanced ruling tribunals and all will help. But it's also partly the atmosphere and the attitude. Because in a sense, what was done for the last 2 years or 2.5 years, and none of the finance ministers could rein them in, was almost like a license to kill that was given to tax.
But you have to understand, Vikram, why
my brother was retired as a very senior officer, chief commissioner of income tax, and he told me that the signals, the finance minister gives them signals, and if he wants tax terrorism, that's the signal he gives them. And when the finance minister and going down through the CBDT hierarchy, if they are told that we are going to be a rules-based organization, we are going to be not harassing assessees, but to be friendly, to be helpful to assessees, that's a very different signal.
But Mr. Das, for that, the first thing the finance minister will have to do is to stop assigning tax targets to every commissionerate.
Exactly.
You see, the reason why
Yeah,
you
you're
have
right.
coercive taxation is
have to
because
be
tax
realistic.
targets have been
Absolutely.
assigned.
You're right.
Tax targets have to be realistic.
Absolutely.
Well, realistic, or they have
No,
to be
no,
stopped getting
incidentally.
assigned.
Could this, is this, Tarun, something which could be done really fast, just by the signals that you send out?
No, absolutely. That I don't think any finance minister says terrorize, but finance minister is saying collect revenue. Government needs money, you know,
Yeah,
and
but
so that's where it
how you
comes from.
say it,
As
Incidentally,
it's
Mr.
how you
Tiwari
say
said.
it.
Incidentally, good chair, and just to add to your basket of woes on the taxes, do you know, for instance, that for what percentage of assessees go in appeal against the first order? You will be shocked to know that 65 to 70% of assessees go in appeal, which means 65 to 70% are dissatisfied.
But we talked about
with the
litigation
initial order.
yesterday,
I mean,
tax
this is
litigation.
I'll give you an
extraordinary.
example. Today, the government announced that the new thresholds for going to Supreme Court, that's 40 lakhs, going to High Court, 25 lakhs, going to tribunal, 5 lakhs. Now, these are baby steps that you need. You know, that's going to cut down your litigation by 30%.
Yeah.
You just taking away the department's right to appeal further. Now, why do they appeal? Because civil servants feel victimized. They feel you have vigilance, you have inquiries. So, besides the obsession for collecting taxes, there are also deeper administrative reforms required for
Trust.
empowerment of officers.
One good thing he has done.
But Mahesh, it is
Yesterday,
not
one
only the
good thing he
pecuniary
announced.
threshold. In most cases, even when you set a pecuniary threshold, and the UPA also did it, you would find that the bureaucracy
was behind tax terrorism.
would find a way around that on a point of law. So therefore, ultimately, everything ends up in the Supreme Court. And that's why what you are talking about is absolutely correct. You need a change of approach. Till the time you don't have a change of approach, all these pecuniary jurisdictions
but it
are not going to work.
goes beyond that. It's not just in tax. If you think about it, why is if you look at litigation and taking the tax point forward, why is there so much litigation? It's because government officers feel that if I don't appeal everything all the way to the Supreme Court and then in review, somebody tomorrow will come and ask the question, why didn't you do it?
Exactly.
So that mindset has to change.
So
That's why the legal system is
short point, you know, this happens during a business down cycle. Historically, I've covered the finance. Whenever there's a down cycle, like Prashant was saying, revenue targets are very tough. And like 2 years ago, Bombay industrialists were complaining that they were actually called by friendly tax officers saying, why don't you pay more tax this year, we'll refund it next year. We have to show some
standard practice.
Prasanjit, let me get you in on this. One of the area that we are sort of identifying as one of the first major signals that can be sent out to turn things around, Sumant, is on the taxation front. In addition to what we heard in the budget speech, what signals would you like to see on the ground?
I think by and large what he said on retrospective taxation is sufficient. I think most investors have sort of taken it on board. I think the rest will just have to wait and see how the tax authorities tend to react and how they operate over the course of the next several months. But I think if I can just put one other factor on the table, you know, something that he should be looking at doing fairly soon is recapitalizing banks. You know, that's one area where liquidity stems from or springs from. He's talked about going down to 51% in terms of ownership. That, you know, capital markets are buoyant right now. There's no better time than now to start accessing the market. And so I really see that the government should really get busy on going to the market and raising money for a variety of things and starting to meet the divestment targets.
And I think what a lot of the people are saying is send signals on disinvestment. Although I have to say, markets are not entirely buoyant after the railway budget. It's been a bad week for the market.
But still, you know, Vikram, 25,000 is where the Sensex is today. It's still pretty good compared to where it was prior to the election. So I think markets are still looking good.
Disinvestment by stealth.
So markets are still looking buoyant, and I think this is a good time.
Yeah.
Okay, so disinvestment, recapitalize banks.
No, he needs that money
about tax. Absolutely, let me get you in.
To make the budget.
No, and you know what this also does, Vikram, one more thing that this does is that this allows Indian corporates also to raise equity from the markets and start deleveraging their balance sheets, which to me is the first step for further and new investments to take place. And that is also beginning to happen. So I think the sentiment in the capital markets is actually very critical to India's growth and recovery. Okay. And I think if this thing, you know, if the markets are good and liquidity is good, I think I agree with Tarun that our growth will rebound faster than what people expect at this point in time.
Okay, Prasenjit.
On the taxation thing, you see, I think the finance minister mentioned in the budget that, he criticized the earlier government for a fall in the tax GDP ratio. My point is that with the kind of narrow tax base that we have, unless you really raise rates, which of course will run into all kinds of problems, unless and until you widen the tax base, how are you going to raise the tax GDP ratio? So I think that is the direction in which, if this government has any common sense, it needs to think that how do you widen? We are a country of 125 crore population with less than 4 crore paying income tax. You see, if you are asking about the priority of this government, I think that the first thing that this government or any government worth its salt that needs to do after these elections is to address the problem of inflation. And I think we have not devoted adequate attention to that problem in this debate also.
You cannot raise...
Good point. Inflation prices. I'm going to come to that after the break.
You cannot increase the tax to GDP ratio by increasing the tax rate. I disagree with this.
Tax base, he said.
Tax base. You can increase it. Well, GST increases the tax base. Having more taxpayers increasing the tax base.
And
we are already
avoiding tax.
Remember one thing.
There are still only 43,000 people who are allegedly rich in this country. I find that number.
And remember one thing, we are still a high tax country. So if you want to have ease of doing business in India, you can't raise tax rates.
We are not a high tax country. Don't spread these myths. We are a high tax country. On what terms are we a high tax country?
I will give the data to you.
Tax GDP ratio with any developing country.
One thing India has proven. This is after Chidambaram's dream budget of 97.
Right.
That the Laffer curve
when you were the revenue secretary.
That the Laffer curve works. India has been quoted again and again around the world by economists as the example of a country where tax revenues boomed
at that time
after the tax rates were brought down.
We'll come back to the
GDP ratio in our country is among the lowest in the world.
Tax to GDP ratio, but tax rates, lower tax rates work in India. So quickly getting a consensus on the question of the Laffer curve. I'm going to take a break and price rise.
You have tax rates, then you have tax exemptions.
Okay, Prasenjit.
So you have effective tax rate is much lower than the actual tax.
Okay, Prasenjit, we're going to go to inflation. You want to discuss that? I'm going to take a break. Then after that, turn to the audience and discuss inflation.
Yes.
We'll be back in just 2 minutes.